Welcome to This Week in Intelligent Investing, where we examine timely and timeless investing topics to help you become a better investor. Enjoy authentic, unscripted discussion featuring Phil Ordway, Elliot Turner, and other thought-leading investors, brought to you by MOI Global. And now, here's your host, John Mihaljevic.
Welcome everyone to a new episode of This Week in Intelligent Investing. Great pleasure to have all of you with us for another discussion, and also my co-hosts Elliot Turner and Phil Ordway. Elliot, I'm going to turn it to you to get us started today, please.
Great. Thanks, John. And hello, everyone. I want to continue with one of the themes that I think has been somewhat recurrent and is a good kind of continuation of last week's conversation on e-commerce. So much discussed, COVID has been not just a step change, but like a new form of commercial activity taking shape. And even in omni-channel, there's this, or even with the word omni-channel, there's this blurring of lines between the physical and the internet. And one of the concepts I've been thinking a lot about is how the internet has given us immense abundance as far as the eye can see. However, increasingly there's this challenge of curation, finding what's right and what's fit and what's appropriate for me. And, this concept of abundance is the opposite of scarcity, and predominantly commercial activities like buying stuff at a store was restricted to what could fit within those four walls. So early in the internet's history, there's this famous article at Wired by Chris Anderson about the long tail and how he truly felt the internet would empower the long tail. And, increasingly you see a lot of evidence of that, though there are these like consolidated aggregators that have considerable power and immense clout themselves. And so when you think of this transition from the scarcity of four walls to the everything store, no company stands out more than Amazon, right? They invented the moniker, the everything store, as far as I can tell. And increasingly, curation has been just starting on Amazon. So before Amazon truly became the everything store, and Google was the first, I'd say, mass accepted search engine that actually worked. So after like Yahoo, Alta Vista, and all those, Google was the first one where you truly start like commercial intent. More recently, Amazon had taken over the start of Product Hunt. According to Bloomreach, 55% of consumers start their search on Amazon. AdeptMind identified, 46% of searches starting on Amazon versus 34% at Google, and everything else being the residual. eMarketer has it at 49% start their hunt on Amazon and 22% on Google. But, from the consumer user experience, I think Amazon has gotten so big and there's so many different verticals, and the situation has become so unique in certain verticals. And it's so wrought with abundance that the search and discovery element of looking for what you want when you don't have explicit brand intent, right? That's a lot of what's captured in these I start my search on. It's getting increasingly challenging to find what's right for me, the customer. And, I think the evolution of a starting point might become far more vertical specific, with key players in each industry capturing interesting facets of the challenge. Not long ago, there was a great Medium piece by Alex Carter, which he basically laid out this thesis of 2020s as the decade of personalized discovery. And, I increasingly believe this is true. And I had pieces in my portfolio that reflected that before I actually considered the fact that this was something that I deeply believe and truly was investing behind. I actually not that recently, over a decade ago, with a friend, was trying this little project of seeing Twitter and understanding curation to be the critical unlock and challenge the platform faced. And yet it's one they're still grappling with, and you see it in the onboarding process. But the hard part is, you're effectively, when there's not that much difference between staring at an empty slate and an infinite slate, because you just don't know where to start in either. There's not much to do. And formerly, when you went to a store, branding itself was a form of curation. When a certain brand put out a certain product, you knew it had certain characteristics of integrity and worked exactly as you'd expect or looked as you'd expect. But increasingly, there are interesting challenges for the internet to tackle. So one of the ones that I absolutely love and find fascinating is Google Photos, for example. If you upload all your photos to Google and you use Google's like Home, as opposed to the like little Nest Hub, the Home Hub with the screen, and if you have a Google account and you upload photos, it starts curating without you doing anything. And it's curated based on, if you use the Android system, places you go. It is timely, so it shows where you were this year, last year, and does a nice like slideshow where you don't have to do anything. You don't have to upload photos. It's just all there and ready, and everything's relevant, and it's interesting. I think that's a really cool way to have taken incredibly complex where, formerly, I remember I went on a safari in high school and I took eight whole rolls of film home. And my parents were aghast. How could you develop 8 rolls? This is crazy. What are you going to do? Now we just snap away. I mean, you might take 8 rolls in 5 minutes of your kid just like, spitting their food out on the plate for whatever reason. And, Google Photos is able to give you a platform where you could curate this and make it interesting. You could search by people, by date, by place. You could search people with a dog or whatever it may be. But that form of automatic curation I find fascinating. You look at a platform like Spotify, where in music, they're able to take an overlay of what you listen to and what your friends listen to and recommend new music that you might find fascinating. And that entirely changes the way music is consumed in general. I can't remember the exact source or the exact reference. My friend Josh Tarasoff had mentioned it to me recently about music behaviors where you typically get effectively cemented into the kinds of music you listen to and the artists you listen to by the time you hit adulthood. And yet with Spotify, that's starting to change, and people have their boundaries constantly pushed because of the nature of the algorithm as the source of what you listen to. The algorithm has become a form of branding in the sense that it's your curation now. Think about Netflix recommendation engine. That's something that didn't exist in the past, where you'd have a platform which is both paying attention, using data to understand what you watch and what people watch and what people find interesting, and then recommending to you what you might want to watch in the future. Did the podcast here with Mario Sabelli on Stitch Fix. I think that's an incredibly interesting vertical where when you open up Amazon and you want to buy shorts, well, there's a ton of options. There's so many options, you effectively don't have a starting point. And with Stitch Fix, they know your size, your shape, your style. And if you want to buy shorts, it's a lot simpler. You're faced with like a narrow range of options that are fitting, pun intended, I guess, for you. Naked Wines, I think, is really interesting. They're building their Wine Genie product, which is a recommendation engine. And when I've spoken with the company, what they've said, and they've said publicly on their calls as well, is like the younger generation who's grown up on the Netflix recommendation engine thinks about these things on an entirely different dimension than does the older generation, who still want a story and a nexus and a relationship with the winemaker, which is more the traditional branding. I think influencers themselves are a form of discovery and curation. There's value to that, but I think it's incredibly imperfect. It's not necessarily personalized in any way, but it is interesting, and I find that fascinating. And then, this general idea of abundance where the internet creates unlimited supply of anything. Bitcoin, the first time the idea actually resonated with me in any way, I'd been aghast at this notion that a cap in total supply was some huge unlock because, hey, say what you will about, Keynesian versus Austrian. I definitely skew the Keynesian side. And, I've had the sense that the monetary supply should grow, whatever, leave that aside. The real innovation was creating digital scarcity, artificial scarcity in a digital world, and that didn't exist. And just last week, Jack Dorsey hosted Jay-Z in a space, which was, I don't know, maybe not quite as exciting as I'd hoped it could be. But there was a really interesting anecdote that Jay-Z gave about the artist basket and how there was a painting that was first sold for a couple thousand, then 10,000, and eventually changes hands for millions. And after that, the artist actually gets nothing following the primary sale. But with NFTs, you could create this digital tag that transacts and transfers alongside with the painting, guarantees, certifies its authenticity, and actually secures the right for the artist to take a portion of it. And, when you think about capacities to create certain kinds of scarcity and to narrow the abundance of the digital world down into something personal, I think there's a very interesting future that might come of it. So these are some examples started, very much with the long tail of internet and trying to whittle it down. Curious what you guys think about the abundance of the internet, the consequences of that, just the vast scale of Amazon, and whether them pushing the scope on how big a company could be for the end consumer, whether that raises things to a high enough level that the niches are so big and people could start chiseling away at verticals. And, whatever else comes to mind, I'll leave it to you guys to take the next step.
The first thing that came to mind when I started thinking about it was how you're correct that we live in this age where there's seemingly an abundance of almost everything, right? I mean, we've talked plenty of times how there's definitely an abundance of capital, and I think that's probably the biggest change that's happened in the past generation or two, right? And you look back to the 70s and the 80s, even the 90s, there were entire asset classes or entire economies, the U.S. included at times, where there was just a clear scarcity of capital. Again, either in little niche assets like distressed credits or, across the whole economy when inflation was so high for good reason. And that's totally flipped on its head, right? I mean, there's arguably a savings glut in most of the developed world, and capital now is so abundant as to be deemed worthless or worse in a lot of economies. So that is a huge change. And I think the internet and the abundance you're talking about has played a role there. And so, some of the things that quickly jumped to mind were the ones that you already called out, things like Netflix and Stitch Fix and certainly Amazon. And I agree. I just don't have a great answer as to which way this goes from here. But you look at the things that are now going to be in shortage or going to be scarce for the next 10 or 20 years. And I don't see how it's going to revert back to capital. It could well be labor, right? I mean, you just had one heck of a shock to the economy in terms of the amount of labor that you removed. And at the same time, you have this crazy abundance of all things created by the internet. So maybe the real shortage is just attention, because even if you have more time, you could spend every moment of every day sifting through all the possible options you could create for yourself on the internet, right? Like whether you're trying to book a vacation, find something to read or watch, something to wear, certainly, because I agree that's probably the one aspect of Stitch Fix that I find so interesting. No opinion on it one way or the other per se, but it is a real problem, right? Like I don't know how to pick out great clothes, right? A lot of people I don't think really trust their own sense in that regard, or they want somebody to do that for them. And I think that's probably the way of the future for the internet. Now that said, I think it's much harder to actually accomplish, good things in that regard, right? I mean, it's one thing to build up hundreds of thousands or millions of data points about if you watch this sitcom, you're going to like another sitcom and recommend it on that basis. Clothing is infinitely harder. There's lots of ways that this can get, really, really difficult operationally. So I don't have a clear example of where this is going from here other than to agree with the general premise.
Yeah, I also would definitely agree that curation is becoming much more important. And Elliot, kudos to you for finding companies that actually do that, like Naked Wines or a Stitch Fix and some others. And I've kind of seen that myself. I've had this thought process around MOI Global for a long time, where it's basically do you try to bring people on board who are going to generate great content, and you end up realizing that the people who generate the best content can just do it on their own. They don't need to be paid by me and be managed by me and so forth. They can just do it themselves, basically. And then if there's some way to curate all of that great content and personalize it, that's another layer of value that gets added. And I think we're constantly kind of adding layers in this digital world, where the more abundance there is, the more there's a need for curation and so forth. And Elliot, you mentioned NFTs and Bitcoin and so forth. I think that's really interesting, because to me, the big asset and what's so wonderful about the digital world is the abundance that, that there's no cost to everyone sharing in certain wisdom or experiences online and so forth. So to actually create scarcity out of that with something like a Bitcoin, to me, doesn't really add value. I mean, I definitely see why people make that argument. And I, as someone who has been a gold bull in the past, definitely also see that. But I don't think, creating digital scarcity is really the right path to pursue. And I think we're still kind of in that speculative phase where the practical applications of this are so scarce that we're not even seeing what this would actually look like if it were, if it came to pass. So, and I hope we don't find out, because if you believe that the gold standard was restrictive and caused depressions and recessions and so forth, the same thing would happen if the world standardized on Bitcoin. So, I think people haven't really thought through a lot of those things. And to me, abundance is a great asset, but it does need to be curated and personalized in the right way.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point. I mean, first, let's pause for a second, John. I think, 1 year into this is the first time you brought up MOI before me in a podcast. So I'm glad you did that. And no, that's a great point and really interesting. And, I think your point on Bitcoin and abundance generally, I think I forgot the exact quote that's attributed to Keynes, where Keynes actually feared that by this time in history, the time we're living in, there'd be so much abundance in the world, no one would have to work. And, Phil, you mentioned work and labor. And I do think to the extent that over the last 20, 30, 40 years, the US has globalized supply chains. We took what was a scarce labor supply in the sense that formerly it was confined to the geographic boundaries of our country and turned it global, and added in, countries where the GDP per capita was far lower, so the wage rate far lower. There's been an abundance in labor. And so we haven't necessarily needed that for the same stuff to the same degree as we had in our country. But yeah, now coming out of COVID, there's this weird, I'd say more frictional scarcity in, we have a blank slate, like a tabula rasa, and how does it get reallocated to what's more necessary and relevant right here, right now, with the new economy? How much is, we don't even know the answer entirely to, exactly what the next 5 years forward, what things look like. Will certain things revert? What won't? We've covered a lot of that ground, but I think it's really interesting. But, I do think, John, to the extent that, abundance is a great thing. Too much of a good thing at a certain point could be too much. And, I felt that recently when I took a digital cleanse. And I was thinking when I first started, like before I got on Twitter, I had an RSS feed through Google Reader. And my feed was like very manageable. And 3 times a day, I could kind of flip through everything and hit everything I'd wanted. And, I kept RSS in parallel with Google in parallel with Twitter through Feedly, even after Google deprecated Reader. And then it hit a certain point where like my feed was, thousands and thousands of pieces a day. And it was either like, I got to delete every source or I just got to stop using this entirely. And, too much abundance, I think a lot of good stuff gets lost in it. So, it gets back again, I think, to Phil's topic of last week, signal versus noise. And that's part of why I think this was, so much on my mind. Or was that 2 weeks ago? But yeah.
Yeah, no, it was last year. And to be clear, like I think the labor issue is an abundance versus scarcity debate. I think you're right. And it's worth clarifying that I don't, obviously the prediction that no one would need to work hasn't exactly panned out just yet. And I don't think we're headed to there anytime soon. Although, as we've talked about before, maybe one of the lasting impacts of COVID is a reduction in the work week, right? It used to be very common that Saturdays, the stock market was open half a day and a lot of people would be in the office at least half a day. And that kind of went by the wayside after the depression. And maybe you see a similar result here from COVID, because I will argue to my dying breath that there is absolutely no chance that productivity is really going to go up over the long term with people working from home. Right? I mean, there's a reason why all these people working from home want Mondays and Fridays as their home day, because they're not doing much, right? They're playing golf or they're taking long walks or they're doing whatever, which, look, is perfectly good. Like, I'm not saying those are bad things by any stretch of the imagination, but they're certainly not getting more work done. So in the industries where more work does need to be done, whether it's, an Amazon logistics operation to fulfill this endless, just in time, on demand kind of ordering, or whether it's things like bars and restaurants that are now having to staff up like crazy this summer, you're going to have these huge bottlenecks and huge friction points and inefficiencies where there's just not enough labor supply to meet those openings, in my opinion. You're certainly seeing that in the number. But to your other point, Elliot, that I think is really important here, I don't know of any information technology companies that really get this right, now that I think about it, because I hate to say this, but I think Twitter's terrible at this, right? I mean, 99% of the time, I don't really care what's trending on Twitter, even within the subcategories, right? I find those to be almost always a waste of time. If I go more than a week or two without cutting somebody from the list of people that I follow, it's pretty unusual, because I just have such a low tolerance for people kind of like spouting off on everything 24 hours a day and giving me a bunch of useless opinions. And I just don't find there to be any good filtering or recommendation engine at any point of the network or the experience of Twitter. And then I look at other things like Bloomberg, right? Where there's just a total deluge of information, right? Like every piece of financial data or news that could ever possibly be available under the sun is at your fingertips, flashing at you in these strange colors. And it's so easy to get lost and end up wasting time rather than, saving time, frankly. In fact, that's the same way, right? And so are most of the other, financial data providers and news providers. So, it's one of the things that I think it's kind of a shame. Like, on the one hand, to John's point, I mean, the information ubiquity is an amazing benefit, right? To have all of the world's knowledge and information at your fingertips, available via your phone, is a huge benefit. But at the same time, it's also kind of a shame to not have a really smart editor curating your newspaper, so to speak, such that that you could spend 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour reading the newspaper every morning and get what you need to get, right? So information technology companies that figure out how to do that in the future, and good luck to them. But if any of them that get even close are going to be enormously valuable.
Yeah, the Twitter example, I think it's amazing to think a decade forward, it's still their biggest challenge and their biggest opportunity, because it's freaking hard, right? If someone tweets out, Warren Buffett quoted Wayne Gretzky saying, skate to where the puck's going, not where it is, or whatever. Do you label that hockey or do you label that investing? And Twitter's been experimenting and tagging certain tweets based on the category they'd show up in very recently. And if you scroll through your feed, you'd start and pay attention to a little of the subtext below some of them. You'll see some of these tags. And there's some people screenshotting and sharing like, haha, how is this tagged as that? And it's like, that's because, people read things differently than a computer inherently can, though they are getting way better, like based on where it was not long ago. And it's, machine learning. So it's the kind of thing where as people see these things and give them feedback and say, oh, it didn't work in that way, it starts figuring out why certain signals are wrong and gets better at an accelerating rate. And that's where I think it's so interesting, because I think we're on the precipice of, a really big acceleration in the capacity to curate and make things personalized in a way that hadn't been possible before. One of the ones I was really interested about, by the way, I should point out, I don't own every one of the companies I listed. I just listed interesting examples. But one example of like the application of curated and personalized information, I unfortunately didn't get to go to the concert because COVID happened. I was supposed to see Pearl Jam at MSG in March of 2020. And I bought my tickets through the verified fan sale. And my understanding of how the verified fan process worked, first off, Pearl Jam was the one who coined the moniker Ticket Bastard. So it was interesting to see the band go all in with, Live Nation, Ticketmaster to kind of do this. But they use data from the streaming services and your history of purchasing tickets to confirm that, yes, you are indeed a verified fan. And only people whose accounts met those specific metrics were able to enter into this pre-sale auction. And it was amazing from a fan's perspective and quite simple, and I got the email in advance saying, hey, you're a verified fan, and go give this a shot. And I think that's pretty cool. So I kind of think the systems are getting more to a point where you could actually do these kinds of things. Though there is some reluctance on data collection and data sharing practices. There's some consumer angst, regulator angst, and that might be a friction in getting to a certain point. But I do think these systems are getting there.
Yeah, and to clarify, I think you made an interesting point there about the curation potential that's out there, and I agree, it's going to get way better. And what will be really interesting to see is in which categories it gets better, because something like Twitter, where it's just a fire hose of raw information and opinions across every topic imaginable, that's really hard. And so maybe they make improvements, maybe they don't. Bloomberg's much narrower than that, and they seem to have made very little headway. But then when you get really narrow, something like TikTok, right? I mean, what is TikTok curating? They're basically curating dopamine hits, right? Like they literally just have a clever algorithm that says, all right, somebody makes a cute video of their cat playing with a toy, and you just see how much engagement it gets. And the more engagement it gets, the more it gets promoted by the algorithm, and you create this massive feedback loop such that, it very quickly narrows the selection of possible videos that are going to go viral. And that algorithm has proven enormously good at both, finding early what things are going to go explode and be viral, and then curating them in such a way that you have this network of choices such that it's, there's not going to be one choice for everybody, but chances are in a very short period of time, you're going to get something that really engages you with the platform. And likewise, Facebook and Instagram, right? I mean, what are they curating? They're curating envy, and they're very, very good at that, right? So along these more narrow channels or verticals where you're just trying to curate kind of one human emotion or one human response, I think those curation machines are already incredibly effective and important. And, again, that gets back to the newspaper metaphor from, back in the day, where it was like, all right, is this kind of nationally important to a reader, an educated reader who's trying to be well-informed about stories of national importance or kind of macroeconomic importance? And okay, that's the curation cut line for the Wall Street Journal, right? And that's pretty easy compared to like, how do you filter or curate this fire hose of information on Twitter or something, right? It's just a much different animal.
Yeah, and I think one kind of big issue is, does the curator have our best interests at heart in curating this stuff? I mean, YouTube is scarily good, quote unquote, at curating, but they're kind of pushing you down rabbit holes and basically accentuating kind of your worst impulses or worst fears or, sensationalist things, where basically, their goal is not aligned with our goal. My goal would be to be happier, to be smarter, and all of those positive things. Their goal is clearly to get me to spend as much time as possible watching YouTube, for Google to make money, and they don't really approach it from another standpoint. So I think we, just need to be aware of that. We're not going to change that anytime soon. That's just how incentives work. But it's important to be aware of that. And maybe somebody will figure out, maybe there is an opening for curators who are going to align this better. We often talk about company management being aligned with shareholder interests. Well, this is kind of similar, where there's also some kind of an agency issue here, where your curator is curating for for its own benefit rather than for your benefit.
Yeah. And well, to the extent that you want to be happier and smarter, I mean, my YouTube recommends great investing videos and a lot of fish music. So it definitely accomplishes that for me. I think there's an extent to which, that's not exactly what every person's looking for, though you're exactly right. There are these feedback loops in the algorithms that'll steer you down a certain direction. And I think in my Spotify example, that's actually a helpful and constructive thing, because it broadens the scope of your music listening without leaving you stagnant, as an adult with just the music you listen to as a teen. But, and I'd argue some might disagree, but that's a good thing. But in YouTube land, in Facebook, that's not a good thing. And, I think, Phil, the example you gave of news is an interesting one, because formerly, the news itself, whether it be the newspaper or the channel, was literally your curation. And like you said, now we do have this fire hose. And that's where I think, the abundance is really challenging. It's scary. And the abundance creates opportunities for curation with sinister motives. So yeah, there's good and bad with all of it. And I do think, it gets back to one of the earlier points. Abundance in certain things isn't necessarily good. It's quite dangerous. And I think or not even just dangerous, but like overwhelming. And so that's where I'm so excited about the opportunities for curation. And yeah, I do definitely, I think it's important that it came up that there is a downside and there's an ugly side. And that happens to be the areas where curation is most perfected as of today. So that's I think one of the challenges, where you're facing this data angst, right? As some of the more harmless and helpful applications might be deployed.
Yeah, I will say too, Elliot, I think that's really important. I mean, it in terms of both, being a better investor and a better analyst, and just being happier in life, overabundance can really weigh on you, right? I mean, there was a period of several years there where I seemed to think that it was my mission in life to cover every possible inch of ground that was out there and read every possible thing, talk to every person. And I was just swimming in too much information, in too much data. And as I've gotten further along and hopefully gotten better, the more I've been able to turn things off and just blissfully ignore them to focus on the fewer and fewer things that actually matter. I think it dramatically helps. And it goes back to, I forget which episode it was that we talked about this, but it's kind of the concept of a uniform at work, right? And you've seen presidents talk about this, right? Where, they would just say, all right, I have a navy blue suit or a gray suit, and I have a white shirt, and I have a red tie or a blue tie. And they're just kind of like laid out in the closet in order, so that when you walk in there in the morning, there's absolutely no decision to be made, right? It's decision fatigue is really real. We talked a little bit about decision fatigue last week with the Kahneman book that's out, and there's a great article in 2011 on that very topic. And I think there's a real fatigue that comes with overabundance, particularly overabundance of information and choices. So it is an opportunity and a threat, that's for sure.
And let's tie this into investing, right? I used to think, like, I gave my generalist manifesto early on, so therefore I'm a go anywhere investor. And as Munger once said, it's about who turns over the most rocks. Yet I think the most important progression I made personally as an investor is saying, like, I'm going to narrow my universe and defining it in a way that was narrow and fit what I needed to be looking for, and made sure the companies I'm working on, are within kind of, narrower scope. It doesn't mean I don't have flexibility to go to different kinds of places. And I mean places in the, literal, not in the literal sense. But I think abundance could be a big challenge. And the more filters you use, the better you get at narrowing the funnel of many things. I think there's a reason why in advertising, the top of funnel is the cheapest cost per, CPM, whatever it is. The bottom of the funnel is the most expensive, right? So, we all have to build our own funnels. And I think that's the job of the next generation of internet companies, to narrow the funnel for everyone as a user.
You're right. And I think that's one of the hardest parts of investing is how to narrow that funnel for yourself. Because if you're just a monkey trying to crank out, a new idea every day or every week or even every month, sometimes you're never going to know when a truly special opportunity comes along. And so, that's another danger from overabundance is if you just think everything's out there all the time, you're never going to notice when something truly special crosses your desk.
Exactly. And relatedly, the ROI of working on a name that's, farther from the core of where your funnel should be, the ROI will be far less. Like if you fast forward 5 years on all those decisions you say no to, I think there's a lot of ROI in those no decisions that you just don't know when, where they're going to manifest, but so long as your funnel's narrow.
Great. Well, thanks, guys. Phil, let's move over to you for your topic of the week.
Sure. So I wanted to talk about something that apparently has come to be known as Firestone's law of forecasting. And I saw this when I was reviewing some old notes. And then I tried to spend a little bit of time on the internet figuring out what the provenance of it was. But I don't think it's actually from Alice Schroeder's book, The Snowball, her biography of Buffett, although some Buffett stuff, of course, as with everything, does tie in here. But anyway, whatever the source is, I apologize for not citing it properly. But Firestone's law of forecasting, it's kind of a Murphy's law kind of thing. I wonder if it's apocryphal. But Firestone's law of forecasting just says Chicken Little only has to be right once, which, of course, has massive and obvious implications once you pause to think about it. And when I read that the other day, it just really hit me right between the eyes because I've just kind of had this nagging feeling for a long time now, going right back to the onset of the pandemic, well over a year ago, that for whatever reason, there was this kind of blind willingness to take on really long-tailed bets that were going against you, right? To basically play Russian roulette. And I've talked about this before, how just stunned I was that, right as the pandemic was setting in February and March of 2020, I was immediately getting calls from every random Joe that seemingly had my phone number, getting texts saying like, hey, what should I do here? What should I buy? And there was just this immediate rush toward speculation in the face of a once a generation pandemic that I really couldn't reconcile. And I really thought was bizarre. And it kind of, my natural tendency then is to zig when everyone zags. And of course, that didn't work out too well for me in the short run. But I do think as you look back at the odds, it really does have a lesson though, because just because something like Hertz ended up pursuing or filing bankruptcy and getting a recovery for its equity shareholders doesn't mean that was right. So to speak, I'm using air quotes here, right or correct or a good decision, right? Because it's sort of like buying a lot of mispriced lottery tickets and having one of them mispriced, meaning that you overpaid for them, right? Like the chances are 50-50, but you only make 25 cents when you bet $1 and you win, like that sort of thing. That's not a great way to accumulate wealth or make good decisions over time. And so I was sort of thinking about this. And if you flip it upside down, like the number of people that have just been taking kind of crazy outsized risks lately. And I'll get into, some of what I've seen lately. And I want to get John and Elliot to chime in with what they've seen lately. But it gets back to this idea that really the primary goal in a lot of investing is to avoid loss. There are lots of people over the years that have said some variation of, I didn't have a lot of money when I started and I'd like to not go back there. And it's amazing how many people have had either through hard work and diligence or just blind luck have been able to accumulate some assets and seem willing to continue to risk it all. The famous Buffett quote about, risking what you have and need for what you don't have and don't need is just plain foolishness. And, he was talking about financial speculators, particularly the leveraged variety at the time. And we've talked before, I think there was a guy written up in the Wall Street Journal who had made a series of rolled cumulative bets buying call options on Tesla last year and had turned a tiny amount of money into a couple of $1 million, which was a huge amount of money for him. It's a huge amount of money for anybody. And yet he didn't see the need to change his behavior or take any money off the table or do anything differently. And that seems kind of bizarre to me. And so I was framing it in the context of a set of probabilities that are very simple and very basic, but I think most people probably don't think about on a daily basis when they're framing risk. And that's just the simple cumulative probability of a low probability event happening over a longer period of time, right? So I don't know if you guys have ever seen this. You guys probably have, but if there's, let's say, a 3% probability of an event happening this year, 3%, pretty low, no big deal, right? Like maybe you're willing to tolerate that. But if you continue to make that bet, and let's assume they're independent, over 50 years, let's call it your adult lifetime, there's a 78% chance of one of those events actually hitting and actually occurring, right? Even if you go down to a 1% event in a given year, right? Let's say there's a 1% chance of a massive power grid failure, 1% chance of a major broker dealer going under and requiring, some sort of financial systemic risk style bailout. Something really bad, a global pandemic's a good example, right? I mean, lots of people would have told you there was at least a 1% chance of that happening in a given year. And we actually went more than 50 years before that finally did happen. But over a 50-year period, the numbers would tell you that's about a 40% chance, right? So 1% in a given year, almost a 40% chance over 50 years. I don't think people really reconcile that concept too well in their heads. And it has big implications, right? I mean, even if you go up to a 10% chance over a 50-year period, that's a 99.5% cumulative probability, roughly. I mean, so it's really pretty astounding. And so I was sort of looking around saying, all right, what 1% odds of a wipeout kind of bet are people taking right now? And I actually came up with a pretty good list of things, which was pretty stunning. I frankly think anybody that's selling options, particularly the Robinhood style crowd that's been so well publicized lately, that's just out there messing around with options when they have no clue what they're doing. Not only they have no clue about this basic elementary math that I just walked through, they have no clue how options work and how human behavior works and how the markets work and how the clearing process works and the settlement process. They have no clue what they're doing. And they're out there buying and selling options. I mean, look, plenty of the professional fund managers out there, I hate to say it, that were really killed by the GameStop fiasco or AMC or whatever else, were killed because of options, right? I mean, options are dangerous instruments, and I don't see why there's a good reason for option volumes to be exploding as they have been for the last year or two, other than just a sign of a speculative market that's being fed by the drug dealers that are the broker dealers like Robinhood that are pushing this kind of stuff out there. It's crazy to see. So, I mean, to avoid this sort of 1% chance of a wipeout in any given year, but kind of a coin flip chance of doing it over your lifetime, just don't mess around with options, right? I mean, that'd be the easiest way to avoid financial Russian roulette. Other ones I've seen on the long side, I mean, if you own a century bond, the so-called century bonds, the 100-year bonds issued by some developing countries or even established countries for that matter, you're taking crazy amounts of duration risk. That seems to me to be just a really bad bet, right? I mean, because the odds of either a total debasement of the currency or an outright default, certainly in my view, approaches that 40 or 50% threshold over a 50-year time horizon. Anything with leverage, frankly, I think is just a force multiplier on these odds and can really bring in some bad outcomes into the picture. One thing that occurred to me too was you often hear this example of, fiat currency is going to be debased so much over time, the US dollar is going to zero or whatever, and that's why I'm going to own a crypto asset or an NFT or some alternative currency. But then flip it around on its head. I mean, do the math where you say, what are the odds of what I'm predicting? And if that happens, what are the outcomes? And therefore, what position size should I have? Because if you think there's a 1% chance of the US defaulting on its obligations or the dollar becoming effectively worthless or going into some sort of hyperinflation mode, I mean, that means that over your investing lifetime, it's more like a 40% chance of that happening eventually, right? And that's not a great example because it's not a truly independent event every year. But that gets back to the point that in financial markets, really low probability events probably breed complacency and reduce that independence every year and make the ultimate outcome actually more likely over time, right? Because if you think, all right, there's only a 1% chance of this company defaulting, and sure enough, a year goes by and it did not default. And the best way to analyze it would be to say, all right, there's another 1% chance next year. In your mind, either implicitly or explicitly, you probably scale those numbers down and say it's less than 1%. And the next year, it's a little less again. And the third and fourth year, it's less and less and less, so that you're actually getting a little bit complacent and skewing the odds artificially low. I think that's, obviously somewhat true in financial markets. If you look at outside of financial stuff, we talked about the pandemic. That's an obvious example. Major hurricanes hitting big cities, like Miami or Houston or whatever. That's a 1% kind of chance every year, but becomes much more likely over decades. Some sort of nuclear attack or nuclear incident. Sam Nunn and the Nuclear Threat Initiative is a fascinating enterprise. If you want to read about some of that kind of stuff, I'd highly recommend it. We almost saw it this year where the power grid in Texas failed in February during that winter storm, where they were literally within 4 or 5 minutes of having the grid fall below the required frequency that would have basically fried the entire thing and put the entire state of Texas into the dark for weeks or months. What were the odds of that coming in? Pretty low, but I think if you'd asked a lot of experts, they would have said that, yeah, sure, maybe that's a 1 in 100 chance this year, and over a few decades, that really does add up. So how do you prepare for this kind of stuff, right? That's the big question. And I think that's where, as an investor, your first filter should always just be, I'm not taking any catastrophic risk, right? I don't care what the upside is. If the downside is zero, I just stop and move on. So even though I couldn't find any evidence for the Firestone's law of forecasting is having been in the snowball, maybe it is. I'll try to go reread the whole thing at some point. It's been several years, but a good example that stands out is the Mid-Continent Tab Company, which is cited as an example in the book and in some of Alice Schroeder's subsequent interviews, which is interesting, right? Because it was actually a fintech of its time. It was actually a computer punch card, kind of raw computational power company. And the founders came to Buffett very early on and said, look, we've got this great thing. It's better than sliced bread of its day. This thing's really going to kill it. And would you like to invest? And he passed right away because it was a brand new company. It was basically a startup. And he said, there's way too much catastrophic failure risk here. I'm not willing to take a zero on any amount of my personal net worth. They came back to him a few years later after the thing had grown like an absolute weed and put up 30 and 40% net profit margins. And it was obviously doing much, much better as a company. And the product itself had like a 1-year payback for anybody that installed it. So the proposition became much, much better. And he put 20% of his personal net worth in the company. And then a few years went by and he made a lot more money personally, but the company killed it to an even higher degree, right? The company's really making tons of money and growing like crazy. And he ended up putting ultimately $1 million into the company and letting it sit then for 18 years and made a 33% compound annual return. Now, if he had rolled the dice at the very beginning, maybe he would have been wrong and he would have lost everything. But what he did was he said, I'm not investing then, but I will invest later at a higher price because the odds are way better, right? Instead of a 1% chance of a wipeout at the very beginning, as low as that may sound, he thought it was a tiny fraction of 1% when he finally invested that $1 million, or even when he invested the $60,000 slug in between. And that to me, I think is the key point. And that's one thing where I will say, even though I've been wrong plenty of times, and I've missed plenty of potential gains that are very painful in hindsight, I really have not taken any dumb risks over the last, call it 10 years, where I look back and think, wow, I was really running around with a knife there, right? The old story that an idiot who runs through a dynamite factory with a lit torch and survives is still an idiot. I've been trying to avoid that pretty diligently for the last 10 years. And I think I've done a pretty good job of it. And I look around and wonder whether I'm just totally out of step right now, or why, or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's not more idiots running through dynamite factories right now with an open torch. But I'll stop there and see what you guys think. Do you have other examples of this sort of 1% odds piling up on you over time, or do you think I'm missing something in the current environment?
Yeah, I don't really have any great examples, but I think these kinds of like trouble with numbers are always interesting. And, maybe it's the flip side of that, but I tend to think the other side is more dangerous. So I'll give you an example. When my wife was pregnant, one of the 2 times she ate a turkey sandwich, it was panicking that she was going to get listeria. So I looked up, And the quote she gave was, "Pregnant women are 10 times more likely to get listeria. Oh my God, I just increased my risk by 10 times over." And you look up, there's 1,600 cases of listeria in the US a year. So pregnant people are 10 times more likely to get something that's way less than a 1 in a million chance. And, just because that's the case, there's an advisory, that says pregnant women are 10 times more likely to get listeria, therefore they shouldn't eat processed meats. And, I just find these sorts of exercises fascinating. I think there's so many different examples where it goes wrong, or where people frame it entirely wrong. I feel like not a year's gone by in this industry, in this business, where there's been a Six Sigma event. And I feel like we've had several years where they're like, I don't know, this one already, several Six Sigma events. And, that tells you something about like something that should happen 1 in a billion samples. And we're definitely not running a billion samples on any of these things. Maybe just the framing is all wrong and the way we're thinking about some of these things are all wrong. But I'd say without a doubt, your point that anything with leverage inherently has this kind of risk, it really resonates with me. And it sits, it's very well situated with what's transpired this year in particular. You look at like amazing investors who, I think that at a certain point you earn the right to take leverage in certain kinds of strategies, like in long, short, low net strategies. But my God, you just got to remember you're trading one kind of risk for another, and just be very cognizant of it. So I'm going to keep thinking of examples as we talk about this topic. I don't have any specific ones right off the bat, but the only other one I'd add is I do think, those people that get mad when they say, 80% chance of rain today and it doesn't rain. Like, my God, I canceled my plans because they said it was going to rain.
Yeah.
Well, that's the way these things work.
Yeah. Not to get me started on the weather, right? There's no area of greater misunderstanding of probabilities, I think. I mean, maybe the financial markets would be a good one too, when you think about the way people behave, particularly with low probability events. But yeah, I mean, look, it's a great example. I don't know if you've been paying attention to this, but what just happened in the Pacific Northwest of the United States is a great example of low probability events coming home to roost. It would have been hard for anyone to possibly imagine Portland, Oregon hitting 115 degrees Fahrenheit like it just did a few days ago, or Seattle hitting 108 degrees Fahrenheit like it did on the same day.
It was mind-blowing. Portland has a higher all-time high than Las Vegas now.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, which is just, and again, so these are the types of low probability events that happen all the time in our world, and yet people kind of whistle past that graveyard. And so maybe it's too much of a public service announcement to say, like, low probability stuff happens. And if you keep running around playing these low probability, picking up nickels in front of a steamroller, mispriced lotto tickets, or however you want to frame it, it's just going to end poorly, right? It's just not going to end well. And there's, and likewise, I've seen like a lot of people get really excited recently about this notion that like, you've got to go big or go home, right? YOLO, diamond hands, whatever the, vernacular of the day is that tries to capture this kind of stuff. And it's like, look, that's great. I obviously concentrate a lot in my own investments, but I like to think that I do it in a very discerning way after hundreds and hundreds of hours of work and thinking about it. And in cases where the odds are so skewed to protect my downside. Whereas, look, if you don't know what you're doing, or you make a mistake, or that 1 in 100 chance, let alone the 1 in 1,000 chance comes home and blows you up. I mean, concentration is the easiest way to get yourself killed, literally and figuratively, right? And I feel like that's kind of fallen out of, the popular mindset lately, which is odd because you'd think that something like a pandemic would kind of drive that point home. I don't know.
I know it might be a tangent, but what number of positions in a book would you say is concentrated?
Well, it gets somewhat subjective. I think, again, it gets back to this idea of statistical independence, right? Because, if you're going to like a factor style analysis, it could be something like what we saw last year, where if you had short-term capital or like a high spending requirement out of portfolio, and you owned 8 different stocks, but 3 of them were like an airline, a hotel, and a cruise line company, that doesn't do a whole lot for you, right? But yeah, I mean, statistically speaking, I think you can run the analysis and look at the covariance between securities in a portfolio, and the incremental diversification benefits beyond like the 15th or 20th security in a portfolio become vanishingly small, right? So I would consider, I mean, for my own purposes, 8 to 12 is pretty concentrated and kind of where I tend to be. But again, I think that borders on the irresponsible for the recreational, do nothing kind of Robin Hood style investor, right? I mean, that's a recipe for disaster, I think, in their hands.
Steve Cohen, in a recent interview, said basically 3 ways to kind of go broke: illiquidity, concentration, and leverage. And actually not by themselves. Like if you have illiquid stocks, but you're just, buying with cash and so forth, you're going to be fine. But basically what he said was the danger comes when you start combining these. So one by itself, maybe you can manage it. But once you have 2 or all 3 of these going on in a portfolio, then you are whistling past the graveyard, as in his words. And Phil, you also reminded me of the Hemingway quote, "How did you go bankrupt? 2 ways, gradually, then suddenly."
Right, yep.
And that's kind of a little bit that point as well. I would say just one thing, and I think it goes back to a discussion we had a while back about kind of probabilistic thinking and taking bets that where the expected value is positive, but it could be a 0. So let's say a coin flip where, if it's, you put up $1, if it's heads, you lose the $1. If it's tails, you get $5. That's something where it can be a 0, but at the same time, it's a positive expected value bet. And I think in the context of a portfolio, those kinds of bets can make sense, especially if you are correct in estimating the probabilities. With a coin flip, we have objective probabilities. In an investment context, we're usually dealing with subjective probabilities, and people tend to overestimate their own ability to peg those probabilities. But if they are the way they are in the investor's favor, a small allocation might actually make sense. So that's,
and I think that's a great point. And I think it's worth exploring, because I totally agree with you. If it's a positive expected probability, or if you're really good at putting together a portfolio of really small, diversified, semi-diversified, mostly independent bets, where the expected value and the distribution of values across the whole portfolio skews hugely in your favor, which most good venture capitalists are expert at that. And you add in the second layer of the incentives, in that, how many venture capitalists have more than 10, 20, 50% of their personal net worth in the venture capital fund itself? I wouldn't guess too many of them, right? So they're enormously well exposed to those sort of right-tailed distributions that work in their favor. What I didn't really understand until I stopped to think about it was these negative expected value, very low probability events. Like, I'm going to go out and buy something with a negative, expected value, or a 0 intrinsic value, and ascribe some value to it in the hopes that it goes up 10x, 100x, whatever, right? And so you look at the AMC's, GameStop's, Hertz stock last year. Hertz is a bad example because there was reflexivity there in getting the bankruptcy court to move forward. But these really bad bets where the people making the bet know that it's a bad bet and they still don't care. But it's just like a lottery mindset, right? I mean, it's just like the person that has no savings and, and doesn't really have a lot of excess money to play with. And they say, oh, screw it. I'm going to spend $10, $20, $100 on lottery tickets, because if I hit one, wow, that's going to make a huge difference. And if I lose the whole $100, who cares? Right. And so that in and of itself is not some tragedy or disaster, but it gets back to the innumeracy of the compounding effect, right? I mean, just like 1% probabilities in a given year really add up to a meaningful chance over 50 years, you start spending, $10 a week over your entire life on lottery tickets that are a terrible bet. I mean, that actually does become somewhat material, right? And I think it just leads to more sloppy behavior and sloppy thinking, and it's just generally not the way to go.
Yep, I would definitely agree with that.
And John, I think your example from Steve Cohen is really interesting because that's another way that people have trouble with numbers because it's like combinatorial factors, they multiply. And I see analysts like lazily take small numbers and add them up to get a result when, they're trying to when they're saying three factors combine. Because in small numbers, you could just add them up and you're going to be right within, one decimal place. But when one of the numbers, when any of the one factors get big and you're just adding instead of multiplying, holy cow, you're going to be off by a mile. And, crazy things happen. And it's interesting to hear him say that recently. I didn't get to read the interview yet. It's queued up on my list in light of what happened to his protege. And that Hemingway quote, how did you go bankrupt? Two ways, gradually, then suddenly. From the sun also rises. I have it sitting, on my desk in a Post-it note that, I just wrote as a reminder myself many years ago, don't let like really bad habits chisel into anything because, gradually, then suddenly is not a good combination. So, I thought it was interesting that you invoked that right there, but there's so many ways that numbers could trick you. And I do find these things fascinating. It's very hard. And, I think this is an important topic. I think we started in a different area, but it's all the same. I don't think it's any different topically.
No, it's not any different topically. I just find it personally useful that, just like if you tape to your desk, don't be an idiot today, it can help you avoid big mistakes and just, kind of think to yourself like, all right, is this a 1% chance that's going to catch up and bite me in the rear end at some point? I think it's a good way to help.
Yeah. I also think after Black Swan came out as a book, like there was this misimpression of, A, everyone saw a black swan everywhere they looked, and B, that all black swans are like bad. So everyone's just looking for like the next bad thing to blow up. And, maybe for one, they are incredibly rare, so they don't happen as often. So this is the flip side of what you introduced topically, but I think it's still kind of relevant. People see outliers everywhere they look, which is, another.
Yeah. That's a great point. That's a really good point because there was this whole like fetish around like, I'm going to be the next Big Short and I'm going to find the next overpriced bubble wherever it was, right? I mean, whether it was in US municipal debt or, China or what were the other themes? Canadian housing was a good one for a while there. So coming out of 08 and 09, there was this huge fetish, like I'm going to find the next black swan and I'm going to be the first one to short it and get Michael Lewis to write a book out of me. And it was all like this negative side thing. And now you're right. It's totally flipped. It's like, I'm going to find the next diamond hands, like rocket to the moon goes up 100x for no reason kind of thing. And so you're right. There's just kind of a fad element to all this. And it's all kind of cyclical.
Yeah, right. You don't see tail risk funds starting today. Those were so popular for a little while.
You don't see anything with a short element starting today, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It also, there's that Bill Gates quote that's different, but also kind of resonates, where he said that most people overestimate what they can do in 1 year and underestimate what they can do in 10 years. I think it's a little bit, well, in terms of what we were just talking about, I feel like, people look at the near term and it's a 1% chance of going bust. It's not going to happen to me. You kind of just want to hope for the best. But as you said, Phil, over time, that really compounds. And the thing is, if you survive that, Russian roulette once and you get that nice payoff, when are you going to stop? That is the big problem with gamblers is they tell themselves, I'm just going to do this once and take the profit and I'm going to stop. And if they did that, you know what? 99% of them would be fine. But they actually don't do that because then you're like, I'll just do it one more time. And I'll just do it one more time. And then you basically only stop when you do blow up.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think, I've had not a lot of people, but a couple of people I know personally that have been involved in private equity roll-ups of various industries or various businesses. And it's an axiom, but it's true that, those things work. And the problem is that they work until the very end and it's the last deal. that kills you, right? And so, because the last deal that doesn't work is always the biggest, right? By definition. And so that's what makes it so difficult and so lucrative, but also so dangerous.
Well, on that note, guys, thank you for another great discussion. Really enjoyed it, and I hope everyone listening did as well. Take care for now.
Thank you for listening to This Week in Intelligent Investing, brought to you exclusively by MOI Global, the research-driven membership organization. Learn more at moiglobal.com.